The body cam footage would later be played in emergency sessions of Congress, dissected frame by constitutional law professors at Harvard and Yale, and watched by over 50 million Americans who couldn't believe what they were witnessing unfold on their screens. It was 2:47 p.m. on a crisp Tuesday afternoon in November when Officer Danny Martinez spotted an elderly black man walking slowly through the pristine corridors of Riverside Commons, the kind of upscale shopping district where the median income exceeded six figures, and the security cameras were designed to be invisible to shoppers who belonged there. The luxury mall buzzed with the quiet efficiency of wealth, well-dressed customers moving between boutiques with the casual confidence of people accustomed to spending more on accessories than most families earned in a month. Crystal chandeliers cast warm light over marble floors so polished they reflected like mirrors, while the gentle hum of climate control maintained the perfect 72 degrees that money could buy. This was a temple to American prosperity, a place where credit cards had no limits and personal shoppers knew their clients by name. But at 73 years old, Justice Harold Washington moved through this rarefied atmosphere with a different kind of authority entirely. The careful dignity of a man whose body had aged, but whose mind remained as sharp as the constitutional law he'd spent 5 decades mastering. His silver-headed walking cane tapped rhythmically against the marble floor, each measured step carrying the weight of experience earned through decades of fighting for justice in courtrooms across America. His charcoal wool overcoat was perfectly tailored, cut from fabric that whispered of quality rather than screaming about price, and his leather shoes were polished to mirror brightness, not from vanity, but from the habits of a man who understood that respect was often determined by first impressions. The small details of Justice Washington's appearance told the story of a life lived with purpose and precision. His wire-rimmed glasses were spotless, his silver hair neatly trimmed in the conservative style he'd maintained since his days as a young civil rights attorney, and his posture remained straight despite the cane that had become necessary after a recent hip replacement. There was something in his bearing that spoke of quiet authority, the kind of presence that made courtroom adversaries think twice before raising their voices and made law students sit up straighter when he entered a lecture hall. Officer Danny Martinez, 29 years old and drunk on the power his badge provided, had been watching the elderly man for 6 blocks of his foot patrol. Something about the sight of a black man moving so confidently through this particular neighborhood triggered every prejudice that festered in Martinez's narrow worldview. In his 8 years of police work, Martinez had developed what he privately called his radar for people who didn't belong in upscale areas, a psychological profiling system built entirely on skin color, clothing quality, and his own deep-seated insecurities about not being wealthy enough to shop in the places he was paid to patrol. Martinez's uniform was regulation perfect, pressed to military standards despite his having never served in any military branch. His equipment belt carried the weight of authority he'd never earned through merit. Handcuffs polished to chrome brightness, radio positioned for easy access, and his service weapon resting in a holster that he touched unconsciously whenever he felt challenged by someone he considered beneath his station. His pale brown eyes held the cold calculation of a man who had learned to weaponize his badge against people who reminded him of his own failures and limitations. The young officer had grown up in the shadow of wealth he could never access, watching from the outside as privileged families enjoyed opportunities that seemed impossibly distant from his own trailer park upbringing. His resentment had calcified over years of traffic stops and foot patrols in neighborhoods where monthly rent exceeded his annual salary, transforming what should have been protective service into predatory surveillance. Every expensive car, every well-dressed pedestrian, every display of prosperity that he couldn't afford became a personal insult that demanded correction through the arbitrary exercise of police power. Justice Washington paused in front of Hartley & Sons fine jewelry, his attention drawn to a delicate silver bracelet displayed in the window with a kind of subtle elegance that suggested both quality and restraint. The piece reminded him of something his late wife might have chosen, understated beauty that didn't need flashy diamonds or elaborate settings to command attention. His granddaughter Sarah's 16th birthday was approaching, and he wanted to find something that would mark the occasion without spoiling the young woman who had inherited her grandmother's grace and her grandfather's determination to make the world more just. The jewelry store's window display was a masterclass in sophisticated marketing, with each piece positioned to catch the afternoon light filtering through the mall skylight. Pearls nestled against black velvet backgrounds, gold chains draped across crystal stands, and engagement rings sparkled with the promise of forever. Justice Washington's reflection in the glass showed a man at peace with himself, someone who had earned the right to shop for his family without explanation or justification, completely unaware that his presence was being interpreted as criminal surveillance by a police officer whose worldview couldn't accommodate the possibility of black prosperity. Martinez approached from behind with the aggressive posture of a predator who had spotted prey, his hand already resting on his radio like a gunfighter ready to draw. His footsteps were deliberately heavy against the marble floor, designed to announce his authority and intimidate anyone who might consider running. This was his neighborhood to control, his beat to patrol, and his version of law and order to enforce against anyone who didn't fit his narrow definition of legitimate citizenship. The confrontation that was about to unfold would expose the ugly reality of racial profiling at its most blatant, captured in digital clarity by multiple recording devices and witnessed by dozens of shoppers who would become inadvertent participants in a constitutional crisis. Officer Danny Martinez was 60 seconds away from making the most career-destroying mistake in the history of modern law enforcement. But his prejudices had blinded him to the warning signs that any competent officer should have recognized in Justice Washington's bearing and demeanor. The elderly man examining jewelry wasn't just another suspicious person to be harassed and moved along. He was one of 9 people in America who possessed the constitutional authority to overturn Martinez's arrest, void his conviction, and reshape the very laws that governed police conduct. But Martinez's racism was so complete, so thoroughly embedded in his psychology, that he was about to assault the living embodiment of American justice, while cameras recorded every word and gesture for posterity. But before we see this arrogant officer make the most career-destroying mistake in law enforcement history, make sure you hit that subscribe button and ring that notification bell. Because what happens when institutional racism meets the highest levels of American justice will completely restore your faith that karma has perfect timing. We cover stories like this every week, proving that prejudice always crumbles when it collides with real authority and genuine heroism. Trust me, you absolutely won't want to miss the moment this racist cop realizes he just screamed at one of the 9 most powerful people in America. Now let's watch this bigot learn exactly who he was messing with. The mall's ambient sound seemed to fade as Martinez closed the distance between himself and Justice Washington, his radio crackling with routine dispatch calls that would soon be overwhelmed by emergency communications about an officer in crisis. Security cameras positioned throughout the corridor began capturing what would become the most watched police misconduct video in American history, while shoppers with smartphones would inadvertently document a confrontation that would change police training protocols nationwide. Justice Washington remained focused on the jewelry display, his trained legal mind unconsciously cataloging the details that would later become evidence in the civil rights lawsuit that was now inevitable. The reflection in the store window showed Martinez approaching with obvious hostile intent, but the elderly judge's military bearing, earned through 2 tours in Vietnam before law school, kept him alert but calm as he prepared for whatever confrontation was about to begin. The stage was set for a collision between prejudice and constitutional authority, between institutional racism and judicial wisdom, between a failed police officer's need to dominate and a Supreme Court justice's commitment to dignity under pressure. In less than 5 minutes, Officer Danny Martinez would discover that some mistakes echo through history, while Justice Harold Washington would demonstrate why character matters more than badges when the true test of American values arrives on a quiet Tuesday afternoon in an upscale shopping mall. To understand why what happened next would be so devastating for Officer Danny Martinez, you need to know exactly who Justice Harold Washington was, and more importantly, who Martinez thought he was dealing with. Because the collision between institutional racism and constitutional authority was about to create a shockwave that would ripple through the American justice system for decades to come. Justice Harold Washington had been born in 1950 in a two-room sharecropper's cabin outside Clarksdale, Mississippi, where the cotton fields stretched to the horizon and Jim Crow laws made basic human dignity a revolutionary act. His father, Moses Washington, had returned from World War II with a Purple Heart and shattered dreams, only to discover that the democracy he'd bled for overseas didn't extend to black veterans in the Mississippi Delta. His mother, Ruth, cleaned white families' houses during the day and taught her children to read by candlelight at night, using a tattered Bible and whatever newspapers she could salvage from her employer's trash. Young Harold had walked 12 miles each way to attend the underfunded colored school, his bare feet developing calluses that would remind him for life of the prices education had cost. But even as a child, he possessed the kind of brilliant analytical mind that could dissect complex problems with surgical precision. While other children played in the dusty streets, Harold read everything he could find. Law books discarded by white attorneys, constitutional documents discovered in library basement storage, civil rights pamphlets that circulated through black churches like underground resistance literature. The turning point had come in 1968 when 18-year-old Harold witnessed the arrest of civil rights workers in his hometown. Watching peaceful protesters being brutalized by police officers who looked remarkably similar to the man now approaching him in this upscale mall, Harold had experienced what he later described as his constitutional awakening, the moment he understood that law could be either a weapon of oppression or a tool of liberation, depending on who wielded it and why. Harvard Law School had been a culture shock that nearly broke him. Harold arrived in Cambridge with 2 suits, $47, and a determination forged in Mississippi poverty. His classmates were the sons of senators and Supreme Court justices, young men who treated constitutional law like an inherited birthright rather than a hard-won privilege. They spoke with the casual confidence of people who had never doubted their right to occupy prestigious spaces, while Harold studied with the desperate intensity of someone who understood that failure meant returning to a world where his potential would be permanently wasted. But Harold Washington possessed something his privileged classmates lacked, the moral clarity that comes from experiencing injustice firsthand and the strategic brilliance that poverty demands for survival. He graduated summa cum laude, became the first black editor of the Harvard Law Review, and immediately devoted his career to using constitutional law as a weapon against the very system that had tried to destroy him. For 25 years, Attorney Washington had fought civil rights cases in courtrooms across the South, facing death threats, firebombings, and judges who made no effort to hide their racial bias. He'd won landmark victories that expanded voting rights, integrated public schools, and established legal precedents that protected constitutional rights for all Americans. His brilliance in constitutional interpretation had earned him a federal judgeship, then appellate court appointment, and finally the ultimate recognition, nomination to the Supreme Court by President Obama in 2015. Justice Washington had been confirmed by the Senate in a 78-22 vote, with even conservative Republicans acknowledging his intellectual superiority and judicial temperament. For 8 years, he had crafted opinions that balanced constitutional originalism with evolving civil rights, earning respect from across the political spectrum for his legal reasoning and personal integrity. Officer Danny Martinez knew none of this history. Looking at the elderly black man examining jewelry, Martinez saw only his own prejudices reflected back, assumptions about criminality, suspicions about legitimate presence, stereotypes about who belonged in upscale spaces and who didn't. Martinez was about to learn that constitutional authority trumps badge authority every time. The first words out of Officer Danny Martinez's mouth would later be analyzed by constitutional scholars as a textbook example of racial profiling in action, preserved forever in the body cam footage that would become required viewing in police academies across America. "Excuse me, sir," Martinez barked, his voice carrying the artificial authority of someone who had confused a badge with actual power. "I need to see some identification. Now." Justice Washington turned slowly from the jewelry display, his movements deliberate and measured in the way that comes from decades of courtroom experience. His eyes met Martinez's with a calm assessment of someone accustomed to evaluating character under pressure. And what he saw in the young officer's face told him everything he needed to know about how this encounter would unfold. "Good afternoon, officer," Justice Washington replied, his voice carrying the cultured cadence of someone who had argued before the highest court in the land. "May I ask what this is regarding?" "I'm simply shopping for my granddaughter's birthday gift." The polite professionalism of Justice Washington's response seemed to infuriate Martinez even more. This wasn't the nervous compliance or defensive anger he usually encountered during these stops. This was something else entirely. The unshakable composure of someone who had faced far more dangerous opponents than an overzealous police officer and emerged victorious through superior intellect and moral authority. "I don't remember asking for a conversation," Martinez snarled, stepping closer in a classic intimidation move. "There have been reports of suspicious activity in this area, and you fit the description. So I'm going to need to see that ID right now, and I want to know what you're really doing here." The lie about suspicious activity rolled off Martinez's tongue with practiced ease, the kind of fabricated probable cause that had worked for him dozens of times before when harassing black citizens in upscale areas. In his twisted worldview, the mere presence of a black man in an expensive shopping district constituted suspicious activity that justified police intervention. Justice Washington's legal mind immediately cataloged the constitutional violations occurring in real time: unlawful detention without reasonable suspicion, racial profiling, false claims of criminal reports. But his strategic intellect understood that this moment was being recorded by multiple cameras, and his response would either demonstrate the dignity that befitted his position or escalate a situation that could become dangerous for everyone involved. "Officer Martinez," Justice Washington said quietly, reading the name tag on the increasingly agitated policeman, "I'm happy to show you identification, but I'd like to understand the legal basis for this stop. What specific suspicious activity am I alleged to have committed?" The question hung in the air like a legal challenge, exposing the emptiness of Martinez's justification while maintaining the respectful tone that Justice Washington had perfected during his confirmation hearings. It was a masterclass in how to assert constitutional rights without providing ammunition for police escalation. Martinez's face flushed red with anger at being questioned by someone he viewed as inherently inferior. In his 8 years of police work, he had never been challenged so eloquently, never encountered resistance wrapped in such professional courtesy. The cognitive dissonance between his racist assumptions and Justice Washington's obvious intelligence was creating psychological pressure that Martinez's limited emotional control couldn't handle. "Don't you dare question my authority," Martinez shouted, his voice echoing through the mall corridor and drawing the attention of shoppers who began pulling out their phones to record what was clearly becoming an abusive police encounter. "I'm a police officer, and when I tell you to do something, you do it. Period." The mask was beginning to slip, revealing the ugly prejudice beneath Martinez's badge. What happened next would be dissected by civil rights attorneys as a perfect storm of racial profiling, abuse of authority, and constitutional violations, all captured in crystal-clear digital footage that would eventually reach the desk of the Attorney General of the United States. Martinez's psychological breakdown was accelerating with each passing second, his professional facade crumbling as Justice Washington's calm dignity exposed the officer's fundamental inadequacy. The small crowd of shoppers gathering around the scene included several who recognized the elderly gentleman as someone important, though they couldn't quite place where they'd seen his face before, perhaps on the news or in newspaper photographs accompanying Supreme Court decisions. "Sir, you're creating a public disturbance," Martinez declared, his voice rising to a near shout that echoed through the marble corridors of Riverside Commons. "I'm going to need you to place your hands behind your back and step away from that store window. You're under arrest for suspicious behavior and failure to comply with a lawful police order." The words hit the air like a declaration of war against the Constitution itself. Justice Washington's legal mind immediately recognized the multiple violations occurring in real time: false arrest, unlawful detention, violation of the Fourth Amendment's protection against unreasonable search and seizure. But his strategic intellect understood that this moment would either demonstrate the restraint that defined great jurists or become a tragedy that would overshadow everything he had achieved in his distinguished career. Mrs. Eleanor Chun, a retired federal prosecutor who was shopping for her daughter's wedding dress, stepped closer with her phone recording as she watched in horror. She had argued cases before Justice Washington during his appellate court days and recognized him immediately. But before she could intervene, Martinez escalated his aggression to a level that made her fear for the justice's safety. "Officer, you're making a serious mistake," Justice Washington said quietly, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had commanded respect in the most powerful courtrooms in America. "I am complying with your requests, but I need you to understand that your actions are being recorded and will have consequences far beyond what you can imagine." The warning was delivered with such measured authority that even Martinez seemed to hesitate for a moment. There was something in Justice Washington's tone, not defiance, not fear, but the unmistakable confidence of someone who understood power structures at levels that local police officers could barely comprehend. But Martinez's prejudices were stronger than his survival instincts. Instead of recognizing the warning signs in Justice Washington's bearing and language, he interpreted the calm authority as insubordination that required immediate and overwhelming correction. "Are you threatening me, old man?" Martinez screamed, his spittle hitting Justice Washington's face as he leaned in with murderous rage. "You think because you dress nice and talk fancy, you're better than me? I'll show you who has the real power here." The transformation was complete. Officer Danny Martinez had revealed himself as nothing more than a uniformed thug whose badge was a license for racial hatred rather than public service. Justice Washington stood perfectly still, allowing the assault to be captured by every camera in the vicinity. What Officer Danny Martinez said next would be quoted in congressional hearings, civil rights training seminars, and constitutional law textbooks as one of the most shocking examples of institutionalized racism ever captured on video. The words that poured from his mouth weren't just professional misconduct. They were a verbal assault on the very principles that Justice Washington had spent his entire career defending. "You people think you can just walk into any neighborhood you want," Martinez snarled, his voice dripping with the kind of racial venom that most Americans believed had been relegated to history books. "Acting like you belong in places like this. Pretending to shop for jewelry you could never afford. I know exactly what you're doing here, and it ain't legal." The phrase "you people" hit the marble corridor like a verbal bomb, its racist implications so blatant that even the most naive observer couldn't miss the hatred behind Martinez's words. Mrs. Chen's phone trembled in her hands as she recorded what was essentially a public lynching disguised as law enforcement, while other shoppers stood frozen in disbelief at what they were witnessing. Justice Washington's response was a masterclass in dignity under fire. "Officer Martinez, I understand you're upset, but I need you to know that your words and actions are being recorded by multiple cameras and witnessed by dozens of people. You still have time to de-escalate this situation before it becomes a tragedy for everyone involved." The calm warning carried the weight of decades spent mediating between opposing forces in the highest courts of the land. But Martinez was too far gone to recognize the lifeline being thrown to him. His years of getting away with similar abuses had convinced him that his badge made him untouchable, that his authority was absolute, and that black citizens existed solely for his harassment and intimidation. "Don't you dare lecture me about tragedy," Martinez screamed, grabbing Justice Washington's arm with enough force to leave bruises that would later be photographed as evidence in federal court. "The only tragedy here is criminals like you thinking they can intimidate honest police officers with big words and fancy clothes." The physical contact crossed every line of professional conduct and constitutional law. Justice Washington, despite his advanced age and recent hip surgery, possessed the kind of physical conditioning that came from military service in Vietnam and decades of disciplined exercise. He could have easily defended himself against Martinez's clumsy aggression, but his judicial temperament and strategic mind understood that any defensive action would be twisted into justification for lethal force. David Park, a constitutional law professor at Georgetown who happened to be shopping for his wife's anniversary gift, recognized Justice Washington immediately and began live-streaming the encounter on his professional Twitter account. Within minutes, his followers included federal judges, Supreme Court clerks, and civil rights attorneys who couldn't believe what they were seeing unfold in real time. "Sir, I'm going to ask you one more time to release my arm and step back," Justice Washington said with the measured tone he used when addressing particularly obtuse attorneys during oral arguments. "You are committing assault on camera, and I strongly advise you to reconsider your actions before they destroy your career and potentially land you in federal prison." Martinez's response revealed the depth of his psychological breakdown and racial hatred. Instead of recognizing the warning signs that any competent officer should have noticed in Justice Washington's bearing, language, and obvious intelligence, he interpreted the composed authority as the ultimate insult to his fragile ego. Federal prison? Martinez laughed with manic hysteria, his grip tightening on Justice Washington's arm. "You think some old black man threatening me with federal prison? I am the law here. I decide who goes to prison, not some uppity." The racial slur that followed would be bleeped out of news broadcasts, but preserved in legal transcripts as evidence of the hatred that had motivated every second of Martinez's abuse. Justice Washington closed his eyes briefly, perhaps praying for strength, as the assault continued. Officer Danny Martinez was reaching for his handcuffs, preparing to arrest a Supreme Court justice for the crime of shopping while black, when a voice cut through the chaos like a constitutional lightning bolt striking the marble floor of Riverside Commons. "Officer, that's Justice Harold Washington of the United States Supreme Court, and you're about to make national news for all the wrong reasons." The words came from James Morrison, the silver-haired manager of Hartley & Sons Fine Jewelry, who had been watching the confrontation unfold through his store's security monitors with growing horror. Morrison had served Justice Washington during several previous visits, including the purchase of his late wife's anniversary gift just 2 years earlier, and he could no longer stand by while watching one of America's most distinguished jurists being assaulted by an ignorant police officer. Time seemed to slow to a crawl as Martinez's hand froze inches from his handcuffs, his brain struggling to process words that didn't fit into his narrow worldview. The bustling sounds of the mall faded into background static as his mind performed computational gymnastics, trying to reconcile the phrase Supreme Court Justice with the elderly black man he had been systematically abusing for the past 10 minutes. What did you just say?" Martinez whispered, his voice suddenly small and uncertain, the aggressive bravado draining from his posture like air from a punctured balloon. His pale brown eyes darted between Morrison's face and Justice Washington's calm expression, searching for some indication that this was an elaborate joke or misunderstanding. Justice Washington reached slowly into the inner pocket of his charcoal overcoat, his movements deliberately telegraphed to avoid giving Martinez any excuse for further violence. From a leather wallet that had accompanied him to oral arguments, judicial conferences, and meetings with world leaders, he withdrew a small rectangular card that would shatter Martinez's world into a million irreparable pieces. The Supreme Court identification card was simple and elegant, cream-colored paper stock bearing the gold seal of the highest court in America, with Justice Washington's photograph and the words that would haunt Martinez for the rest of his life: Harold Washington, Associate Justice, Supreme Court of the United States. The federal government identification number, the official seal, the embossed lettering. Every detail confirmed what Morrison had just announced to the growing crowd of witnesses. Martinez stared at the card as if it were written in hieroglyphics, his limited intellect struggling to process the magnitude of his mistake. The gold seal of the Supreme Court seemed to burn into his retinas as his brain finally began to understand what he had done. For 10 minutes, he had been screaming at, threatening, and physically assaulting one of the 9 most powerful people in America, someone whose decisions shaped constitutional law for 330 million citizens. This can't be real," Martinez stammered, his voice cracking like an adolescent's, as the full weight of his career-ending stupidity crashed over him. "You're not. There's no way you're actually." The crowd of shoppers pressed closer, their smartphones capturing every moment of Martinez's psychological breakdown in high-definition clarity. Mrs. Chen's live stream had attracted thousands of viewers, including several federal judges who were watching in real time as a racist police officer discovered he had just committed assault against a member of the Supreme Court. Professor Park's Twitter thread was being retweeted by constitutional scholars across the country, each adding their own commentary about the historical significance of what they were witnessing. Justice Washington's response demonstrated exactly why President Obama had nominated him to the highest court in the land. Instead of unleashing the righteous fury that would have been completely justified, instead of using his constitutional authority to destroy Martinez's life with a single phone call, the elderly jurist chose the path of grace under pressure that had defined his entire career. "Officer Martinez," Justice Washington said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of moral authority that no badge could ever provide, "I want you to take a deep breath and think very carefully about your next words and actions. What you've done here today has been recorded by multiple cameras and witnessed by dozens of people. You've committed assault against a federal official, violated my constitutional rights, and displayed the kind of racial bias that brings shame to law enforcement everywhere." Martinez took an unsteady step backward, his hand falling away from Justice Washington's arm as if he'd been struck by lightning. The aggressive posture that had defined him throughout the encounter melted away, replaced by the hunched shoulders and darting eyes of a man who suddenly understood that he was in more trouble than his limited imagination could comprehend. "Sir, I didn't know," Martinez began, his voice now carrying the desperate tone of someone trying to talk his way out of a disaster entirely of his own making. "Didn't know what, officer?" Justice Washington interrupted, his judicial authority cutting through Martinez's pathetic attempts at damage control like a constitutional sword through butter. The reckoning had arrived. Can you believe this racist cop just assaulted a Supreme Court justice on camera? The moment Martinez realized he'd been screaming at one of the most powerful people in America was absolutely priceless. But what Justice Washington did next will completely restore your faith in grace under pressure. If you're loving watching this bigot get exactly what he deserved, smash that like button and let me know in the comments. Have you ever seen someone's prejudice backfire this spectacularly? Because Justice Washington's response shows exactly why he sits on the highest court in the land. The psychological destruction of Officer Danny Martinez was happening in real time, captured in devastating detail by security cameras, smartphones, and body cam footage that would soon be analyzed by federal investigators, constitutional scholars, and millions of Americans who couldn't believe what they were witnessing. His face cycled through a spectrum of emotions: confusion, denial, horror, and finally the nauseating realization that his career, his reputation, and possibly his freedom were evaporating before his eyes. "Didn't know what?" Justice Washington repeated, his voice carrying the calm authority of someone who had spent decades questioning witnesses and exposing lies in the highest courts of America. "Didn't know that racial profiling is unconstitutional? Didn't know that assault is a federal crime when committed against a Supreme Court justice? Or didn't know that your badge doesn't give you the right to terrorize citizens based on the color of their skin?" Each question hit Martinez like a physical blow, stripping away the layers of justification and denial that had allowed him to rationalize 8 years of racist policing. The elderly man he had been screaming at just minutes before was systematically dismantling his worldview with the precision of a surgeon removing a tumor, and Martinez could do nothing but stand there and absorb the constitutional education he was receiving. Mrs. Chen's live stream had exploded with viewers as word spread across social media that a racist cop was getting destroyed by a Supreme Court justice. The comments were scrolling too fast to read, but the consensus was clear. Millions of Americans were watching Martinez's career die in real time, and they were not sympathetic to his plight. Screenshots of his badge number and name were being shared across every social platform, ensuring that his disgrace would follow him for the rest of his life. Professor Park's Twitter thread had been retweeted by constitutional law professors at Harvard, Yale, Stanford, and Georgetown, each adding their own analysis of the historical significance of what they were witnessing. This wasn't just police misconduct. This was an attack on the judicial branch of government by the executive branch, a violation of separation of powers that could trigger congressional hearings and federal investigations. Within 15 minutes of Morrison's revelation, the first news vans were pulling into the Riverside Commons parking lot as reporters scrambled to cover what was already being called the most shocking police misconduct incident in modern American history. The footage of Martinez assaulting a Supreme Court justice while screaming racial slurs was guaranteed to dominate news cycles for weeks, potentially reshaping national conversations about racism in law enforcement. Justice Washington's response to the entire ordeal became a masterclass in judicial temperament that would be studied in law schools for decades. Instead of using his immense constitutional authority to destroy Martinez immediately, instead of making phone calls that would have had FBI agents arresting the officer within the hour, the elderly jurist chose a path that demonstrated why he had earned universal respect across the political spectrum. Officer Martinez, Justice Washington said with the measured tone he used during Supreme Court oral arguments, "I want you to understand something very important. What you've done here today goes far beyond personal insults or professional misconduct. You've attacked the very foundations of American justice, the principle that all citizens are equal before the law regardless of race or economic status." Martinez stood frozen, his earlier bravado completely evaporated as he faced the most powerful legal mind in America. The irony was crushing. The man he had dismissed as a suspicious criminal was actually one of the architects of modern constitutional law, someone whose decisions shaped the rights and freedoms of every American citizen. "I could make a single phone call," Justice Washington continued, his voice never rising above conversational level, but carrying absolute authority, "and have federal agents here within minutes to arrest you for violating my civil rights under color of law. That's a federal felony that carries up to 10 years in prison. I could ensure that your actions today are investigated by the Department of Justice, that your department faces federal oversight, and that your conduct becomes a case study in police academies across the nation." The words hung in the air like a judicial death sentence, and Martinez finally understood the full scope of his mistake. He hadn't just harassed another citizen. He had assaulted a member of the Supreme Court while cameras recorded every second. His actions would trigger investigations at the highest levels of government, congressional hearings, and reforms that would reshape law enforcement training nationwide. But Justice Washington wasn't finished delivering his constitutional lesson. "However, Officer Martinez, I'm going to give you an opportunity that you didn't extend to me, the chance to learn from this mistake and become better than your worst moment. Instead of calling for your immediate arrest, I'm going to recommend that you receive comprehensive training on constitutional rights, implicit bias, and the proper role of law enforcement in a democratic society." The grace under pressure was stunning, the kind of moral leadership that had defined Justice Washington's entire career and would now define this moment of national crisis. The transformation of Officer Danny Martinez from arrogant predator to humiliated cautionary tale was complete, but Justice Washington's demonstration of constitutional grace was just beginning. What happened next would be quoted in Supreme Court confirmation hearings, cited in civil rights training programs, and remembered as the moment when American justice triumphed over institutional racism through the power of dignity and moral authority. "I accept your offer for training, Your Honor," Martinez whispered, his voice barely audible as he unconsciously used the formal address reserved for federal judges. The psychological whiplash of discovering he had been screaming at one of the most powerful people in America had fundamentally altered his brain chemistry, replacing 8 years of racist arrogance with a terrifying understanding that his actions had consequences beyond his comprehension. Justice Washington nodded slowly, recognizing the genuine fear and newfound respect in Martinez's voice. This was what constitutional justice looked like in practice. Not revenge or retribution, but the patient work of transforming ignorance into understanding, hatred into humility. "Officer Martinez, I hope you understand that real authority comes from serving others, not dominating them. Your badge represents a sacred trust that should protect all citizens equally." The crowd of witnesses watched in amazement as one of America's most distinguished jurists delivered an impromptu civics lesson to the police officer who had just assaulted him. Mrs. Chen's live stream had reached viral status, with viewers from around the world watching an elderly black man teach constitutional principles to his own attacker. The comments section exploded with admiration for Justice Washington's grace and disgust at Martinez's behavior. Within hours, Martinez was suspended without pay pending a federal investigation. The Department of Justice launched a comprehensive review of his 8-year career, uncovering a pattern of racial profiling and constitutional violations that had been ignored by supervisors who enabled his behavior. The 37 previous complaints against him were reopened, with victims who had been silenced finally finding their voices as federal prosecutors built a civil rights case. But the real transformation happened in the weeks that followed, as Justice Washington used his experience to advocate for sweeping police reforms. His testimony before Congress about the incident sparked bipartisan legislation requiring implicit bias training, constitutional education, and civilian oversight of law enforcement agencies. The footage of his assault became mandatory viewing in police academies, not as entertainment, but as a stark reminder of what happens when prejudice replaces professional judgment. Martinez's criminal trial became a national spectacle, with Justice Washington's dignified testimony serving as the centerpiece of federal prosecutors' case. The former officer was convicted on multiple civil rights violations and sentenced to 3 years in federal prison, his law enforcement career ending in the disgrace he had spent years earning through his racist conduct. The Riverside Commons incident sparked a nationwide conversation about dignity, authority, and the true meaning of American justice. Justice Washington established the Constitutional Policing Foundation, using his platform to train law enforcement officers on the proper balance between public safety and constitutional rights. His response to Martinez's assault became a template for how real leaders respond to hatred, not with vengeance, but with the patient work of making society more just. Mrs. Chen organized community dialogues that brought together police officers and citizens across racial lines. Professor Park's documentation of the incident became the foundation for a comprehensive study of racial profiling in upscale commercial districts. The jewelry store manager, who finally spoke up, became an advocate for bystander intervention training, teaching others not to remain silent when witnessing injustice. Justice Washington returned to his quiet shopping, but now he carried something new, the knowledge that even in America's darkest moments, constitutional principles can triumph over institutional racism when good people refuse to look away. His granddaughter Sarah received her silver bracelet on her 16th birthday, along with a story of how her grandfather had transformed a moment of hatred into a lesson in justice. The Supreme Court issued an unprecedented statement condemning racial profiling in law enforcement, with Justice Washington's experience serving as a powerful reminder that constitutional rights belong to all Americans regardless of race, age, or appearance. His judicial opinions in subsequent cases carried added authority, backed by the personal experience of someone who had faced institutional racism and responded with constitutional grace. Justice Washington's story proves that true power isn't about the authority to arrest or intimidate. It's about the wisdom to turn hatred into healing and injustice into inspiration. While Officer Martinez thought he could abuse his badge to humiliate someone based on skin color, he learned that constitutional authority and moral character are more powerful than prejudice and false power. If stories about real heroes standing up to systemic racism inspire you, you absolutely need to subscribe and ring that notification bell. We cover cases like this every week, proving that justice might be delayed, but it's never denied when good people refuse to stay silent in the face of institutional hatred. The comment section is blowing up with your reactions to Justice Washington's incredible grace under pressure. Let me know what you think about how he handled this racist cop's assault. Next week, we're diving into the case of the racist bank manager who tried to have a young black woman arrested for trying to deposit a suspicious check, until she revealed she was actually the FBI agent investigating the bank for money laundering. Trust me, her reaction when she flashed her federal credentials was absolutely devastating for everyone who had doubted her. Remember what Justice Washington proved that day. Real authority comes from character, not from badges or guns or false power. Constitutional justice and dignity under pressure will always triumph over institutional racism when Americans refuse to accept hatred disguised as law enforcement. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next story where justice gets served Supreme Court style.